This is lecture week 4, part 2, the second part of this lecture. And here I'm just reviewing the article by Barbara Bergman on gender equality and how we achieve that gender equality, where she considers different policy options in promoting advancement for women. First, she starts with a basic definition. So she's talking about gender equality and what she means by that. And to do so, she looks back at history, and she's looking at traditional gender arrangements between men and women. And of course, she notes that historically, women have been relegated to different roles in both politics and leadership positions in terms of employment in the work setting. Women have been segregated into different roles there. In terms of just the labor market, certainly the types of jobs that women hold, women have been segregated into different positions as well. We don't need to look any further than our field to see that. You see how women are represented, are highly represented in the social work field, in the teaching field, and so forth. She's making this type of argument. And then finally, she says that in terms of the pay, so historically, women have been paid less for even the same type of work, and so there's been that sort of differential. And for the most part, women have been separated into the public sphere. So women typically or historically have stayed at home and taken care of the household services, household cleaning, laundry, food preparation, childcare, and so forth. This is a traditional gender arrangement that we've seen historically in the U.S. I like this quote by Barbara Bergman, by Professor Bergman. She says that we know how much housework a newly born baby is destined for just by looking at its genitals. And so I think that's a nice little quote that illustrates what she's getting at here. And so in defining gender equality, she's noting that gender equality would be the absence of these arrangements, would be the absence of these traditional arrangements, essentially. So she brings us to her definition of gender equality in this first section. She's envisioning a path towards gender equality and how we get from where we are in terms of the traditional gender arrangements to a more equal society between men and women. And she's noticing that more and more women have been purchasing these services, these activities that women are typically responsible for. That more and more women are purchasing these activities. She's talking about commodification here. That's the language she uses. So commodification of household activities and chores. She says that to achieve greater gender equality, that we need to move further in this direction. And so we could do this in one of two ways. So the child care, the household activities, the cleaning and such, the laundry, we could do this through a private mechanism. We could simply give women more money to do this, or we could do this through more of a public mechanism where the government becomes more involved in these activities directly. And of course, the side note here is that any sort of remaining activities would be more equitably distributed between men and women. But the main point here is that we're considering different policy options here. How do we get to a more gender equal society? Well, we have to figure out some way to have greater commodification of household activities and chores. And so we consider three different policy options. We consider the basic income grant in this article and the welfare regime, two different welfare state regimes. And so we're considering three different policy options to promote greater gender equality. First, the notion of a basic income grant. Basically, this would be a universal grant that would be financed through a progressive income tax, so a higher rate of tax on higher income individuals relative to lower income individuals. And this grant, this cash grant, would be distributed evenly throughout the population. So it would be a universal grant to all women who are caring for kids and such. The other regimes or the other policy options, you have the low provision regime or policy option 2. This typifies the current situation in the U.S., more conservative regime. You have relatively low rates of taxation for funding household activities and chores. This is leaving it up to the private market, basically for women to go ahead and purchase these services directly. So this is policy option 1, a low provision regime that she's considering. The second of the two welfare state regimes that she's considering is a more liberal regime. So we would have greater rates of taxation, and with that revenue, we would have more direct government involvement in the provision of household activities and chores. So she says, look at the case of Northern Europe, for example. You have relatively high rates of taxation, relatively speaking to our nation state, but you have much more in the way of social services. There's often universal health care, medical, dental care, lots of different social services, high quality childcare in many instances. So this is what she's considering, this type of regime. And she also notes that in many of these regimes, there's also lengthy paid parental leave policies that are also in place. Very generous parental leave policies in many Northern European welfare states. And so these are our three options: the basic income grant, the less generous welfare state regime, and then the more generous welfare state regime. Her basic conclusion, it's an argument, it's part of her general argument, but among the three different options, she notes that the most generous regime, the high provision welfare state regime, would be the most conducive to generating gender equality. The low provision ranks second among her rankings. And then, of course, the basic income grant, the basic income grant is the worst of the three options, she notes. And so she gets into a discussion about why that is. But first, she considers some other options. So might there be a fourth option? She says we could consider combining some of these different options. We could consider combining a basic income grant with maybe one of the welfare state regimes, but she notes that this would be prohibitive. This would be, her language is unsustainable. And so by unsustainable, she's looking at the tax rates, and she looks at the case of Sweden. And in the case of Sweden, she notes that some of the tax rates have been upwards of up to 60% of national income in some instances. As of the writing of this article, this was back in 2004, those were the rates that were in place, but they've since gone down somewhat. But nevertheless, she's noting that these rates of taxation that would be required for any combination of these policy regimes would be unsustainable and prohibitive for us. And so as an economist, I'm sure she has the work effort, productivity or efficiency in mind. And so if we were this generous, what would it do in terms of the work effort I think she's probably considering here. In laying out her argument, she also notes, she also distinguishes between the different regimes. She notices that the basic income grant is different in the sense that we have a universal grant on the one hand. The basic income grant would be universally provided. And of course, the welfare regimes, we have selective provision of goods and services in both the low provision regime and the high provision regime. So you must have low income and assets to qualify for these services, these hypothetical services. And she also notes the distinction in terms of the type of benefit that's offered. So in the case of the basic income grant, you have a cash grant, an income support program, in other words, that would be provided directly to the families or the women. And then you have an in-kind grant in the case of the welfare regimes where the government would provide the service directly. So in conclusion, she makes the argument that the high provision regime would be the most conducive, and she's thinking about the work effort, the impact that it would have on the economy. So she notes that the high provision regime would allow women, would free up more time for women to enter the labor market, and hence would allow for more equalization of pay and of job prestige and of the types of jobs that women are able to engage in. She also notes that the basic income grant would be the worst of the three options because of this effect on the labor market. And so the basic income grant, she notes, would promote withdrawal from the labor market. With this basic cash grant, women would be more inclined to leave the labor market as opposed to entering the labor market. So in terms of employment, in terms of the economy, it would have a negative impact, she's noting there. And then finally, she takes issue with one aspect of the very generous welfare regime, and that's the parental leave policy. She doesn't like that aspect of the very generous regime because that also promotes withdrawal from the labor market. If you think through the logic, of course, with a very generous parental leave policy, the incentive there would be for people to stay out of the labor market and not to enter the labor market. And so for that reason, she's suggesting a slight modification of that high provision regime. So her basic conclusion is that the high provision regime, minus the very generous parental leave policies that might typify some of the Northern European countries, would be the most conducive to promoting gender equality. Now, there's certainly lots of different counter-arguments, even from within maybe the feminist camp. So if one believes that it's the labor market itself that creates and reinforces the patriarchal gender relations between men and women in the first place, then maybe keeping people out of the labor market, keeping women, that is, out of the labor market, maybe that's a preferable option. So in that case, the basic income grant might be the most conducive to promoting gender equality. That's just one argument that's thrown out there in the article. And so we can think about which option we might be promoting in terms of what we think might be most conducive to gender equality. So that's part two of this lecture in conclusion.